On the 29th of August 1945, the United States terminated Lend-Lease. Without warning, without consultation, without transition. Britain had just won the Second World War. 55% of its entire economy had been geared toward war production. Its foreign reserves were empty. Its cities were bombed. Its people were rationing food. And in one day, with one decision, America cut off the lifeline that had kept Britain alive. John Maynard Keynes had been warning the British government for months. He called what was coming a financial Dunkirk. The most famous economist in the world told his own government that Britain was heading for a financial catastrophe as severe as the military one it had barely survived 5 years earlier. Attlee sent Keynes to Washington. Parliament expected a gift, a grant in recognition of the fact that Britain had fought alone for 2 years before America entered the war. Britain had sacrificed more of its economy, more of its people, and more of its empire than any other allied nation. Keynes believed he could secure it. He went to Washington expecting justice. He came back with a loan, $3.75 billion at 2% interest, and buried inside the agreement were conditions that would dismantle the British Empire faster than any army ever could. Keynes returned from Washington with the loan and a heart attack. He died 4 months after the agreement was signed. Britain did not finish repaying until 2006, 61 years. The war ended in 1945. The debt ended in 2006. And the empire? The empire ended at Suez in 1956, the day America used this loan to force Britain to its knees. This is that financial documented story. Stay with me, because this was not generosity. The loan agreement is a public document. The Hansard debates are accessible. The Treasury records are at the National Archives in Kew. Every clause in this video is sourced. To understand why this loan killed an empire, you first need to understand what that empire looked like the day the war ended, and why America wanted it dismantled. On the 8th of May 1945, the war in Europe ended. Britain was on the winning side. But winning had cost everything. Britain's national debt had exploded from £7.2 billion in 1939 to £21.4 billion by 1945. The country owed £3.7 billion in sterling balances. IOUs accumulated during the war to countries that had supplied Britain with goods, services, and soldiers. The largest creditor was a colony. Britain owed £1.3 billion to British India alone, accumulated under the Defence Expenditure Agreement that had supplied 2 million Indian soldiers to fight Britain's war. Egypt was owed £440 million, most of it from British military spending on its soil. Iraq, Palestine, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, all creditors. The empire that Britain ruled was owed money by the country that ruled it. Britain's gold and dollar reserve stood at just £620 million. Its external liabilities were $3.7 billion. The ratio of reserves to debts was 1:6. Any bank with that balance sheet would be declared insolvent. Britain's export income had collapsed. Before the war, British exports generated over £500 million a year. By 1945, that figure had fallen to below $350 million. The factories that should have been producing goods for export had been producing tanks and aircraft for 6 years. The empire itself was bleeding money. Britain was spending £2 billion a year maintaining military bases, colonial administrations, and occupation zones across the globe. Keynes calculated that the cost of the empire alone exceeded Britain's entire remaining financial capacity. And then, Truman pulled the plug. On the 29th of August, 4 days after Japan surrendered, the White House announced the immediate termination of Lend-Lease. No transition period, no phased withdrawal. Ships carrying supplies to Britain that were already at sea were turned around or billed immediately at full commercial rates. Britain had been receiving $7 billion a year in Lend-Lease aid. In one day, that dropped to zero. The BBC later called it the moment Britain was virtually bankrupt. The country owed £4.2 billion to creditors abroad. Its £2 billion overdraft facility with the world's most powerful nation was cancelled at a stroke. Its income from overseas investments and exports had been halved since before the war. The timing was not accidental. The United States wanted leverage. As long as Britain was financially dependent, America could dictate terms. And America had very specific terms in mind. The dollar was to replace sterling as the world's reserve currency. The sterling area, the network of countries that traded in pounds and held their reserves in London, was to be open to American exports. The imperial preference system, the tariff structure that gave British goods favorable access to empire markets, was to be dismantled. America did not want to destroy Britain. It wanted to replace the British Empire with an American-led economic order. And the loan was the mechanism. Keynes understood all of this. He knew what America wanted. He knew what Britain needed. And he believed, with the confidence of the most celebrated economist of his generation, that he could negotiate terms that would protect British sovereignty. He was wrong. In September 1945, Keynes sailed to Washington with Lord Halifax, the British ambassador. He carried a brief from the cabinet. The instruction was clear: secure a grant in aid, not a loan. A grant. Justice for a nation that had held the line against fascism for 2 years while America watched. Keynes believed he could do it. He had redesigned the global financial system at Bretton Woods a year earlier. He had negotiated with Roosevelt. He had shaped the International Monetary Fund. He was, in the words of his biographer Robert Skidelsky, the most influential economist since Adam Smith. Washington was not interested in justice. William Clayton, the Assistant Secretary of State for Economic Affairs, made the American position clear within the first weeks. There would be no grant. There would be no interest-free loan. There would be a commercial loan at 2% interest, and it would come with conditions. Keynes spent 3 months negotiating. He and Halifax opened Britain's books to the United States Federal Reserve. They laid bare the full scale of the financial crisis. The sterling balances, the export collapse, the imperial costs, the reserve position. They spent 3 days presenting the numbers. The Americans already knew. Clayton proposed $5 billion at 2% over 50 years. The British cabinet rejected it. They were still expecting a grant. Keynes was caught between a government that would not accept a loan and an ally that would not offer anything else. By December, Britain had no choice. The reserves were running out. The alternative to accepting the loan was national bankruptcy. On the 6th of December 1945, the Anglo-American Financial Agreement was signed. $3.75 billion from the United States, a further $1.19 billion from Canada, 2% interest. 50 years to repay, but the money was not the mechanism. The conditions were. Clause 7 required Britain to make sterling fully convertible into dollars for current account transactions within 1 year of the loan being ratified. Any country holding sterling, and dozens of countries held sterling, could convert it into dollars on demand. Clause 9 required Britain to eliminate imperial preference, the tariff system that protected British exports across the empire. Clause 10 required Britain to support the International Monetary Fund's rules on exchange rates and trade liberalization, rules that had been written at Bretton Woods under American leadership. The loan gave Britain enough money to survive the next 18 months. The conditions gave America the tools to dismantle the next 3 centuries. Keynes defended the agreement in the House of Lords. He told the peers, "Our American friends were interested, not in our wounds, but in our convalescence. They wanted to be told that we intended to walk without bandages as soon as possible." The House of Lords was furious. One member called America Shylock. Another called the agreement an instrument of financial servitude. But the vote passed. Britain had no alternative. Keynes returned to his home in Sussex. His health had collapsed during the negotiations. He had suffered a series of heart attacks in Washington. On the 21st of April 1946, 4 months after the agreement was signed, John Maynard Keynes died. The man who had warned of a financial Dunkirk did not live to see the flood. The loan was ratified. The clock started. Britain had exactly 1 year to make sterling convertible. What happened when that clock ran out was the fastest financial crisis in modern history. The convertibility clause was scheduled to take effect on the 15th of July 1947. 1 year after the loan was ratified by Congress, the British Treasury knew it was coming. They knew it was dangerous. Chancellor Hugh Dalton argued for a delay. The reserves were not strong enough. The export recovery was too slow. The sterling balances, £3.4 billion owed to countries across the world, were a ticking bomb. The moment those countries could convert their sterling into dollars, they would. The Americans refused to delay. Convertibility was the price of the loan. The clause was non-negotiable. On the 15th of July 1947, sterling became convertible. Within 1 week, the Bank of England lost over $100 million in reserves. Countries that had been forced to hold sterling during the war, countries across the empire and beyond, began converting immediately. They wanted dollars. Dollars could buy American goods, sterling could buy British goods, but Britain had almost nothing to sell. Egypt, owed £440 million, began converting. Egypt requested permission to accumulate an independent gold reserve. The British Treasury called the request completely unacceptable. But under convertibility, Egypt had the right to convert. And it did. The sterling area countries, the captive market that Britain had built over decades, were converting their reserves into dollars as fast as the Bank of England could process the transactions. The system that had kept British trade alive was dissolving in real time. By the 10th of August, the drain had accelerated. $175 million lost in 5 days alone. The American ambassador in London, Lewis Douglas, cabled Washington with the figures. He reported that the Bank of England estimated a minimum future drain of $175 million per week and a probable maximum of $300 million per week. At that rate, the entire remaining loan would be exhausted within a month. The cabinet held emergency meetings. Dalton warned that the reserves were approaching the danger point. The Treasury calculated that only $850 million of the loan's line of credit remained. The convertibility that America had demanded was consuming the loan that America had provided. On the 17th of August, 33 days after convertibility began, the cabinet met on a Sunday to debate suspension. The question was not whether to stop. It was how to tell the Americans. On the 20th of August 1947, convertibility was suspended. 37 days. That is how long it lasted. The clause that America had insisted on, the non-negotiable condition of the loan, had drained over $1 billion from Britain's reserves in just over 5 weeks. The loan that was supposed to save Britain had been used to defend sterling against the very convertibility that the loan required. Britain had borrowed $3.75 billion and spent a significant portion of it fighting the consequences of the conditions attached to it. The convertibility crisis did not just drain reserves, it drained credibility. Sterling, the currency that had underpinned global trade for a century, was exposed as fragile. 2 years later, in September 1949, the pound was devalued from $4.03 to $2.80, a 30% drop, the largest single devaluation of a major currency since the war. The dollar was now the undisputed global reserve currency. The sterling area was cracking. The imperial preference system was being dismantled clause by clause. Everything the loan conditions had been designed to achieve was happening, not through military force but through financial architecture. Consider what this means in financial terms. Before the war, sterling accounted for roughly half of all global foreign exchange reserves. By 1947, the convertibility crisis had exposed it as indefensible. By 1949, the devaluation confirmed it. The pound lost 30% of its value against the dollar in a single announcement. Any investor, any central bank, any government holding sterling reserves watched their wealth shrink by nearly a third overnight. The countries across the empire that had been forced to hold their reserves in sterling, the same countries that had supplied soldiers and goods during the war, paid the price for Britain's financial dependence on America. The loan was not just a debt, it was a transfer of financial sovereignty from London to Washington, and Britain was still repaying it. The convertibility crisis proved what Keynes had feared. The loan was not a lifeline, it was a leash. And in 1956, 11 years after the agreement was signed, America pulled it tight. In July 1956, President Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal, the canal that the Rothschilds had helped finance, the canal that Disraeli had purchased Egypt's shares in with a £4 million dinner handshake in 1875, the canal that carried 2/3 of Europe's oil supply. Britain's Prime Minister Anthony Eden decided to take it back, by force. Eden conspired with France and Israel in secret. The Protocol of Sèvres, signed in a villa outside Paris on the 24th of October 1956, laid out the plan. Israel would invade Sinai. Britain and France would issue an ultimatum demanding both sides withdraw from the canal. When Egypt refused, as they knew it would, British and French forces would intervene as peacekeepers. It was a fabricated pretext, and Eisenhower had not been told. On the 29th of October, Israel invaded. On the 31st, British and French aircraft began bombing Egyptian airfields. On the 5th of November, British paratroopers landed at Port Said. Eisenhower was furious, not because Britain had used force, because Britain had lied to him. And then he used the one weapon that no British army could fight. The financial weapon. The pound came under immediate pressure. Investors and central banks began selling sterling. The Bank of England drew down its dollar reserves to defend the exchange rate. Tens of millions of pounds were lost from Britain's reserves in the first week of November. Britain needed emergency support. The government applied to the International Monetary Fund for a drawing of $561 million. Eisenhower blocked it. No ceasefire, no IMF support. Then he escalated. The United States threatened to sell its own holdings of British government bonds, sterling bonds held by the U.S. Treasury. If America dumped its sterling holdings on the open market, the pound would collapse. Devaluation, inflation, economic crisis. Harold Macmillan, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the man who had told the cabinet that Eisenhower would lie doggo, now told Eden the reserves could not survive another week without American support. His own permanent secretary at the Treasury had warned him before the invasion. Britain could not sustain a military campaign without American financial backing. Macmillan had ignored the warning. Now the warning was reality. On the 6th of November 1956, less than 48 hours after paratroopers landed at Port Said, Eden accepted a ceasefire. British and French forces withdrew. A United Nations force replaced them. It was the first time in history that financial leverage alone had forced a great power to abandon a military operation. Not a shot was fired at Britain. No army defeated it. No navy blockaded it. A phone call from Washington and a threat to the pound ended the British Empire as an independent global power. Eden resigned in January 1957. His health and reputation shattered. The Suez Canal reopened in March 1957 under Egyptian control. The canal that Britain had fought to reclaim remained in Nasser's hands. The empire that had built it, financed it, purchased it, and garrisoned it for 80 years could no longer act without American permission. The consequences cascaded across the empire. Within 5 years of Suez, Britain withdrew from most of its remaining colonies. Ghana gained independence in 1957, Malaya in 1957, Nigeria in 1960, Sierra Leone, Tanganyika, Kuwait, all within 5 years. The empire that had taken 3 centuries to build was dismantled in a decade. Harold Macmillan, the chancellor who had miscalculated at Suez, who became prime minister when Eden fell, gave his famous Wind of Change speech in Cape Town in 1960. He told the South African parliament that the wind of change was blowing through the continent. He did not mention that the wind had been generated by a loan agreement signed in Washington 15 years earlier. And the loan, the 1945 loan that had given America the leverage to make all of this possible, was still being repaid. The loan survived Suez. It survived the decolonization of Africa. It survived the Cold War. It survived the fall of the Berlin Wall. It survived the creation of the European Union. The world changed entirely, and Britain kept paying. The final installment on the Anglo-American loan was paid on the 29th of December 2006, 61 years after it was signed. But it was not a smooth 61 years. The loan agreement contained a clause allowing Britain to defer annual payments if its foreign exchange reserves fell below a critical level. Britain exercised that right 6 times. 6 separate years in which the world's former superpower told America it could not make the payment. The deferrals came in 1956, 1957, 1964, 1965, 1968, and 1976. Each one a public admission that Britain's finances had not recovered. Each one a reminder that the loan was still there, still accruing interest, still defining the relationship between borrower and lender. The total amount repaid, principal plus interest, was $7.5 billion to the United States and $2 billion to Canada. Britain borrowed $3.75 billion. It paid back double. The loan agreement is a public document. It is accessible at the National Archives in Kew. The Hansard debates of December 1945, in which the House of Lords tore the agreement apart while voting to accept it because there was no alternative, are in the parliamentary record. Robert Skidelsky's 3-volume biography of Keynes, The Definitive Account, documents every stage of the negotiation. Volume 3, Fighting for Britain, covers the Washington talks in detail. Keynes' own correspondence, preserved in the King's College Archive at Cambridge, contains his private assessments of the American position. The Treasury records at Kew document the convertibility crisis of 1947, the reserve figures, the daily drain, the emergency cabinet meetings, the suspension after 37 days. The Suez records, declassified and held at the National Archives, document Macmillan's miscalculation, Eisenhower's financial pressure, and the cabinet's decision to accept a ceasefire to save the pound. Diane Coons's The Economic Diplomacy of the Suez Crisis is the definitive account of how America used financial leverage to end the last act of British imperial power. The pattern this loan created is not unique to 1945. It is the same pattern that has been applied to every nation that has ever borrowed from a stronger power on terms it did not fully understand. A nation in crisis borrows from an ally. The ally attaches conditions. The conditions transfer financial sovereignty. The borrowing nation spends the loan defending itself against the consequences of the conditions. The lender gains control, not through force, but through architecture. Britain won the war. It lost the empire. Not to Germany, not to Japan, not to the Soviet Union. To a loan agreement signed on the 6th of December 1945 in Washington by men who understood exactly what the conditions would produce. Keynes understood it too. He warned his own government before he left for Washington. He fought against the terms. He argued for better conditions. He failed. And then he died. The documents are at Kew. The debates are in Hansard. The biography is in Skidelsky. The crisis is in the Bank of England's reserve ledgers. The Suez records are declassified. Everything is available. Everything is sourced. The only question the documents raise is the one that matters most. If this was an alliance, why did it come with conditions designed to end an empire? Subscribe if that question stays with you. And tell me, where are you watching this from? If you haven't seen it yet, watch the video on how Rothschild lent Disraeli £4 million over dinner for the Suez Canal, the same canal that ended the British Empire 11 years after this loan was signed. And if you want to see how the same patterns that killed empires in the 20th century are still wrecking billion-dollar companies today, check out our new channel, Billion to Bust. Link in the description. I'll see you in the next one.